Longhorn was the initial version of Windows Vista before it became one of Microsoft's most famous operating systems. Development began in May 2001 before Windows XP had even finished shipping, and Microsoft originally planned it as a relatively quick in-between release. The roadmap was to have Whistler XP first, Longhorn second, and then Blackcomb as the true next-generation Windows. Even its name came from the Longhorn Saloon, the bar sitting between Whistler and Blackcomb Sky Resorts, which was fitting for its roadmap position. It was originally scheduled for 2003, but Longhorn suddenly began getting big features directly from Blackcomb. The biggest was WinFS, a database-driven file system where documents, emails, contacts, and photos could be linked by relationships instead of folders, allowing searches that sounded almost impossible in 2002. Alongside that came Avalon, which was a hardware-accelerated graphics system that would later become Aero, and Indigo, a major redesign of app communication. Early leaked builds like 3683, 4008, and especially 4074 showed off Plex styling, sidebar, glass effects, even centered taskbar experiments nearly 20 years before Windows 11. But Longhorn was becoming a disaster with too many memory leaks, Explorer crashes, broken drivers, endless dependencies, and constant feature creep, which all made the project nearly unshippable. By August 2004, after build 4093, Microsoft scrapped years of work entirely, cut features like WinFS, and restarted development from the stable Windows Server 2003 codebase, likely one of the biggest software resets in tech history. Nashville was an internal Microsoft project that started around 1995 to 1996, and officially it was never meant to be a totally new version of Windows. Internally, it was more like Microsoft asking a pretty aggressive question for the time: what if the browser was Windows? That sounds normal now, but in 1996, with Netscape Communications dominating browsers, dial-up internet becoming mainstream, and websites starting to feel like software, it was a pretty wild idea. Like Chicago, Memphis, and Cairo, Nashville followed Microsoft's city codename tradition, acting like the weird bridge between Windows 95 and Windows 98. Its biggest change was merging Internet Explorer directly into Windows itself. Before Nashville, Explorer and Internet Explorer were separate, but Nashville experimented with folders behaving like web pages behaving like folders, and browser controls being embedded throughout the system. This also became the foundation for Active Desktop, where the desktop could show live web content, HTML elements, channels, news, sports, or stock prices, which in 1996 was way ahead of its time. It also introduced WebView, replacing boring file details with previews, thumbnails, HTML descriptions, and linked content. Known builds like 999 and the much rarer 1381 showed these shell changes, Internet Explorer integration, and WebView concepts. Nashville was eventually cancelled, but not because it failed. Microsoft just realized its features worked better folded into Internet Explorer 4 and later Windows 98, meaning Nashville died, but its DNA was shipped anyway. Neptune was an internal OS that started around 1999 with a huge goal. Microsoft wanted to finally kill off the old consumer Windows line, including Windows 95, Windows 98, and even Windows Me, which was still in development, and replace it with something built on Windows NT. That mattered because NT was far more stable, more secure, fully 32-bit, had proper memory protection, and made it much harder for a single application to crash the entire system. The problem was that NT had been mostly built for use in offices, servers, and in general enterprise machines, so Neptune's blue ocean here was to make NT usable for normal users, especially as by the late 90s, consumer Windows had a pretty bad reputation for just too many blue screens, driver crashes, constant reboots, and one bad app freezing everything. The most famous Neptune build is 5111, and if someone mentions Windows Neptune, this is almost always the build they're talking about. Its most famous feature was activity centers, where instead of a normal desktop, users were given task-focused hubs for stuff like music, photos, and documents, which for 1999 was pretty ahead of its time. Neptune also had multiple family accounts, simplified setup, a friendlier logon system, and underneath it all, stability from NT. Neptune was eventually cancelled after Microsoft realized it was accidentally building two next-generation operating systems at once, which was Neptune for home users and Odyssey for business users, which I'll talk about later in the video. And in the early 2000s, both projects were merged into Whistler, which later became Windows XP. Blackcomb was Windows' next-generation goal for Windows, planned internally between roughly 1998 and 2000 as the operating system that would follow Whistler, which again later became Windows XP. While XP was designed to unify Microsoft's home and business operating systems, Blackcomb was supposed to be a completely new foundation focused on many big things like smarter storage, stronger security, richer graphics, web services, and far better search, not just XP with some improvements. Its biggest planned feature was the previously mentioned WinFS, which I'll add used NTFS storage, SQL-style indexing, and metadata data relationships to achieve its better file searches. Blackcomb also planned deeper identity integration, with user settings following you across devices, integrated authentication, profiles, and secure credentials, all ideas that later influenced Microsoft accounts and enterprise login systems. Security was of course a major focus, especially as malware like Code Red, Nimda, and SQL Slammer were hitting Windows hard, so Blackcomb would have stronger permissions and application isolation. It also planned a modern graphics system with hardware acceleration, vector rendering, and animated interfaces, technology that later became Avalon. But around 2001, Microsoft realized Blackcomb was simply getting too large, so they created Longhorn as an intermediate release. But after moving Blackcomb features like WinFS, Avalon, and Indigo into it, Longhorn became overloaded and eventually also collapsed. And after the 2004 Longhorn reset, Blackcomb effectively stopped existing as its own product, and unlike Longhorn, Neptune, or Nashville, no publicly verified Blackcomb builds are known to exist. Chicago was Microsoft's codename for what eventually became Windows 95, and before it, most home users were still running MS-DOS alongside Windows 3.1, which had the program manager, separate DOS and Windows environments, cooperative multitasking, awkward memory management, and no real start menu or taskbar. Microsoft wanted Chicago to be a 32-bit consumer operating system with easier plug-and-play hardware, preemptive multitasking, long file names, and a completely new interface that could turn PCs into hobbyist machines into something normal families could actually use. Development started around 1992, shortly after Windows NT began, and internally Chicago started as little more than Windows 3.1 with modern improvements, but it quickly became much bigger. The early milestone builds like 58 and 73 from 1993 still looked closer to versions of Windows 3, and only fragments of them still exist today. By build 122 in 1994, early taskbars, start button concepts, and long file name support were appearing, and by build 189, the start menu was finally becoming recognizable, which as we know became one of the most copied interface ideas in computer history. Microsoft also experimented with menu trees, vertical taskbars, and alternate task switching layouts before usability testing pushed the start menu forward. Chicago also introduced plug-and-play hardware detection, although many users later joked it meant plug-and-pray with I guess how inconsistent it was, but I wasn't born in the prehistoric era of the 90s, so I can't be too sure. By builds 347 and 468, Chicago was nearly complete, and on August 24th, 1995, it officially launched as Windows 95. Odyssey began around 1999, and Microsoft wanted it to replace Windows 2000 with a more modern enterprise operating system. This was when home users were still on DOS-based systems like Windows 95 and 98, while businesses were running Windows NT 4.0 and Windows 2000, which were far more stable but still felt very corporate. Odyssey was Microsoft's attempt to push business Windows forward while Neptune modernized home computing, so unlike Neptune, Odyssey wasn't trying to be for typical people, and was all about enterprise deployment, corporate security, networking, domain management, mobile business computing, and hardware scalability, so basically Windows 2000 but just far better. One of its biggest goals was tighter integration with Active Directory, allowing for easier domain logins, centralized permissions, better credential handling, and stronger user policy management overall, much of which later appeared in XP Professional. Odyssey also planned better dock and undock support, wireless networking, power management, roaming profiles, and offline file syncing. This was also a time where worms like Melissa and I Love You were spreading across corporate networks, so Microsoft implemented better fixes for those as well. Odyssey existed as a real development branch, but unlike Neptune's famous 5111 build, no publicly famous Odyssey builds are known, as it was later bundled into Windows XP. Windows 1 Interface Manager is the oldest lost Windows version and is what eventually became Windows 1, and it started around 1981 to 1982 when Microsoft was watching two major things happen at once. IBM PCs were exploding in popularity, while Apple was innovating graphical interfaces through the Mac Lisa. Most IBM PCs still booted straight into MS-DOS, meaning a blinking C prompt, no icons, no mouse, no windows, and no real multitasking for normal users. But Microsoft knew text-only computing wasn't the future, so internally they began building a graphical shell for DOS called Interface Manager. On November 10th, 1983, Bill Gates publicly announced Interface Manager in New York, promising it would ship in April 1984, although it would actually take nearly 2 more years. Microsoft's original demos promised mouse support, multiple programs running at once, pull-down menus, on-screen windows, and device-independent graphics, which for 1983 was incredible and put them on the level of Apple. Due to this actually, they had a feature where programs couldn't overlap and instead snapped into fixed sections, because Microsoft was worried about Apple's graphical interface patents. During development, Interface Manager was eventually renamed to Windows after employees reportedly felt the original name sounded too corporate, which was definitely a good call in my opinion. Early public demos also looked noticeably different from retail Windows 1, with alternate menus, title bars, icons, and debugging tools, but no fully verified Interface Manager builds are publicly preserved today. After years of hardware limitations, memory issues, and constant delays, Interface Manager finally shipped on November 20, 1985 as the first ever Windows. There are of course so many more lost Windows versions than these popular ones, and if you know any, please do comment them and share your knowledge. Perhaps you were some top secret Windows employee whose NDA expired yesterday. And if you hype and share the video, I'm sure it'll reach these people. So make sure you do that if you enjoyed, and thank you for watching.